This podcast series by the National World War II Museum is made possible by the support of the Dale E. and Janice Davis Johnston Family Foundation.
General MacArthur signs as Supreme Allied Commander. The first pen used is presented to General Wainwright of Corregidor. The second pen to British General Percival, commander at the surrender of Singapore. MacArthur uses 6 pens in all, affixing what will be the most important signature in Japan to the document that ends permanently that nation's regime of terror and aggression.
Let's go back in time to 1942 and the island of Corregidor in the Philippines. Back in December, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had attacked the Philippines. U.S. defenders and their Philippine allies, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, had withdrawn to the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. President Franklin Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave the Philippines to avoid capture, which he did, leaving General Jonathan Wainwright in charge. MacArthur ordered General Wainwright not to surrender no matter what happened. The situation since then had changed. Food and supplies were running low, and Wainwright feared a massacre of his men by the approaching Japanese. And now Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, commander of U.S. forces on the island of Corregidor and in the Philippines overall, is about to make an agonizing decision. He's about to order surrender.
This is Lieutenant General Wainwright. Subject, surrender. I decided to accept, in the name of humanity, and will, surrender all troops.
Wainwright went into Japanese captivity alongside his men, becoming the highest-ranking American POW of the entire war. He was transferred from prison camp to prison camp for years, all the while wondering what the American public thought about the terrible decision he had been faced with. He was given only limited information about the war and few chances to write to his wife back in the U.S. By the end of the war, nearly no one knew whether the general was still alive or where he could be found. Fast forward now to August 1945. The U.S. has dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, and the Emperor has announced his intention to surrender. But no one knows whether local Japanese commanders will actually comply with the Emperor's decision, or whether they might execute American POWs before they do. The race to find General Jonathan Wainwright and thousands of other POWs is on, and OSS will take a leading role in a daring mission called Operation Cardinal. Jeff Rogg joins me again. Jeff, thanks for being here, and who is General Wainwright?
Thanks, Bradley. And General Wainwright had a nickname, unfortunately, Skinny, John Skinny Wainwright. And when you see the pictures of him after the Second World War, I mean, he wasn't already, a well-built figure. And then after the Second World War, you can see the famous pictures of him standing behind MacArthur on the deck of the Missouri during the surrender. And I don't even know how he was standing at that time, a couple weeks after he was rescued. Wainwright, like many American generals, had real military pedigree. He was a long-standing service member through the First World War and into the interwar years, and he rises to the position of he's the commander of American forces on the Philippines when the Japanese are pressing them. And so all this responsibility, and it's considerable. He has tens of thousands of men. It's not like he doesn't have a fighting force. He has to decide, though, with what their desperate position is, do they fight to the death? Do they get starved to death? I mean, this is how desperate their plight is.
They're on an island.
They're on an island and getting pushed, and he makes this agonizing individual decision, made more agonizing by the fact that General Douglas MacArthur was pushing them to fight on. And he knows that means, the fighting on means the death of thousands or tens of thousands of his men. And so in May 1942, he surrenders, and this is a major, major shock to the Americans. And it's one that now Wainwright sits with as a prisoner of war for the next 3 years.
What I find so tragic about this story overall, in addition to the general human tragedy of it, is that Wainwright is effectively out of touch for most of the war. He seems to receive some letters via the Red Cross, but he's moved between a series of POW camps. And for all conducive purposes, he's missing to the outside world. I've seen press reporting where his wife is writing to him, and there's press photographers taking photos of her doing so. She doesn't know whether her husband will ever receive these letters or even where he is, which I think speaks to sort of the wider situation at the end of the Second World War in Asia. Let's talk about this Operation Cardinal, to rescue Wainwright and others. What goes into the planning for this operation? We've talked about the liberation of other camps like Cabanatuan. This is a very different type of operation.
That's right. This is more of a humanitarian operation than it is sort of the, special operations shoot 'em up mission that Cabanatuan was. So Wainwright's moved around, as you mentioned, and he ends up in Manchuria. He ends up, north of where North Korea is today. And remember, even though he's a general, the highest ranking general taken POW, that doesn't really give him exceptional treatment. He's still abused by the Japanese, and he's malnourished, and he suffers abuse. And I think the worst abuse is probably of his own making. In his own mind, he doesn't know. He thinks that the American public hates him. He feels like he's a coward, and he has to live with this by himself while enduring deprivation for 3 years. We're approaching the end of the war in August 1945, and the problem is the end of the war isn't exactly the end of the war, and especially not when you talk about the East. The Soviets are still fighting the Japanese, and you have a long simmering, and it's going to be exposed soon, Chinese civil war going on between the nationalist forces and the communist forces.
Well, and also the Soviets have only just entered the conflict against Japan recently.
And so they're fighting to retake, they're trying to conquer Manchuria. The Japanese are sort of doing a fighting retreat. The Americans just want to get their people out of there, not get involved fighting either way. And so that's, again, this is where special operations in the OSS are helpful. There's actually special operations hostage rescues that don't involve shooting. It's just you want some of your really well-trained people there just in case. And so the Cardinal team combines SI and SO, Secret Intelligence and Special Operations from the OSS. And again, they went with this OSS small team. There were other commando elements they could have gone with and they thought about, but they don't want to get into a shooting fight with either the Japanese or the Soviets or the Chinese communists for that matter. And so a Major James Hennessy is selected along with a Major Robert Lamar, and Howard Lath, and linguists. This is important. These are small teams. And when I say linguists, you actually need multiple linguists. You need people who speak Russian. You need people who speak Japanese. You need people who speak Chinese. And so this small team, though, is sent in. And remember, they have pistols. They don't have guns. And they're going to be parachuted in. Now, this isn't like gunner side. They're not parachuted in at night. They parachute in broad daylight. And they also parachute in with quite a bit of equipment. And a lot of the equipment is actually food, because these POWs, they're dropping dead of starvation and malnourishment. And so they drop in, roughly half a ton of food with them. And the Cardinal team is immediately met by Chinese civilians first. But remember, they're also behind Japanese lines. And so they're met by Japanese soon after. And not all the Japanese know about the surrender. These are sort of field units. So the Cardinal team, when they land, they split up, and some of them are trying to gather the supplies, and the other half are going to find the POW camp. And unfortunately, half the team's captured by the Japanese, and they're actually, blindfolded and stripped and beaten. They're carrying guns. They're beaten a little bit. They're roughed up. And the other half that finds the POW camp, the Japanese officer at least treats them a little bit better. Things are confused. The whole battlefield's confusing. And so the Japanese are very much on edge. Now, the teams eventually reunited, which is good, and they're taken to a Japanese military headquarters where there's different stories about this, but apparently a very apologetic colonel offers them sake and whiskey, and one telling of the story says that he offers to surrender, then to commit harikiri, ritual suicide in the Japanese tradition, but the Cardinal team says, thanks, but no thanks, we're not here for that. The team's taken to the POW camp, and they find a general there, General George Parker. He's the ranking POW, but they don't find Wainwright. and they find out that Wainwright's in a camp 100 miles away. Now, remember, they'd already been parachuted in. It's not like they're going to get picked up and dropped right on the spot. So the team needs to actually figure out what to do now. This is where being resourceful in small teams is helpful. So the team's going to split up again, and Robert Lamar, because he's a doctor, is going to go, and the linguists are going to take a 26-hour train ride to find Wainwright at this POW camp in Xi'an. And when they find him, he's in a bad way. And so the team takes a roster of the prisoners who are there. And it's not just Wainwright, it's also Arthur Percival, who was the governor general, a general in command of Malaya, and he's the one who had surrendered Singapore to the Japanese in February 1942. So you have some pretty high-ranking figures at this POW camp, and you think, you want to secure them, but Lamar says, well, we have to figure out how we're going to get you out of here. It's not as easy as it sounds. So Lamar takes off and leaves a linguist in case the Soviets get there. The Soviets are on their way. And now you're Wainwright, and it's like, wait a minute, you just got here and you're already leaving me. And so what happens is the Soviets actually get there. And so Wainwright talks, I guess, to the Soviet, commander, and the Soviets are going to take a convoy to actually go back to where the OSS Cardinal team is headquartered. And so Wainwright commandeers a couple of vehicles to load the POWs on, and the Soviets they're getting lost along the way. They don't know where they're going. And so now if you're the Cardinal team, it's like, where's our POWs? Where's our general? All's well that ends well, luckily. So they end up back with the main Cardinal team. And the reason why there's all this urgency too is MacArthur wants Wainwright and Percival at the Japanese surrender. This is late August 1945. The surrender's on September 2nd. So it's like, hey, we got to get you, we got to get Cinderella to the ball. And so you lost your POWs, and they eventually make it. Again, all's well that ends well. And so now you get Wainwright out of there on C-47s, but you still have you have over 1,000 POWs who are left who are malnourished. And so one of the this is where planning comes in. We talked about planning with Cabanatuan. One of the problems was parachuting supplies. I mean, they need food, they need clothes. Apparently, they need some guitar strings, to keep morale up with music. But when they parachute the supplies in, they drop them in too hard. They're dropping like from low altitude, and a lot of the containers are crashing. And at one point, the Cardinal team says, like, stop dropping this stuff on us. You're literally dropping them on our heads, and it can kill people. The other part, though, of the Cardinal team mission that's sort of secret is, I said it was humanitarian, but you have to remember, when you have spies, when you have intel people on a team, it's never just going to end there. So their job wasn't actually just to get Wainwright out of there and they leave. Their job was also to collect intelligence on the ground. And that includes collecting intelligence on the Japanese, on the Soviets, on the Chinese communists. And that means even staying there after the fact. And so you see the beginnings of the Cold War even with the Cardinal team. And the way you see it is, well, for one thing, when the Soviets actually take the North and they take over, there was an agreement that they were supposed to hand it over to the Chinese nationalists. But they're actually collaborating with the Chinese communists. And when the Chinese nationalists lose Manchuria, the dominoes start falling. So the Soviets are help setting the condition for the communists of China to eventually win the Chinese Civil War. And this makes the Cold War, infinitely worse for the United States. The other interesting thing about the Cardinal team is that they don't realize that back home in the U.S., the OSS is being disbanded. So the directive's already signed by Truman in September, and it's effective October 1st that the OSS is done, October 1st. And the Cardinal team, without realizing it, there's an organizational swap that takes place, and they go from being OSS to what's called SSU, the Strategic Services Unit, because the SI, the Secret Intelligence, and the SO, Special Operations elements of OSS, get folded into the SSU. And then Research and Analysis Branch and Morale and other elements get folded into the State Department, and it becomes INR today. So, there's a lot of post-World War II and early Cold War history that's occurring at the exact same time in the same place. The postscript with the Cardinal team, though, is really about Wainwright. What happens to Wainwright? So just as MacArthur promised, Wainwright's present for the surrender. And you see these pictures at the museum. And MacArthur, it's complicated about what his relationship with Wainwright is, because he had pushed Wainwright not to surrender. And then he sort of becomes this like argumentative figure about when Wainwright's, he's a POW, the position of Wainwright in the minds of American leadership in the interim. But then, we see him hugging Wainwright when Wainwright's recovered. He gives him one of the pens he uses to sign the surrender document. Percival is next to Wainwright too. And again, these are two desperate figures who only weeks earlier had endured 3 years of being POWs. And then, poor Wainwright probably just wants to get home. And instead they ship him to the Philippines to see the surrender there, which is symbolic. And he probably wanted to be there. But when he makes it to the U.S., that's really the key, because here's a guy who had spent 3 years in his own head about what his fellow Americans thought of him. And it turns out they thought he was a hero the whole time.
In an oral history interview with the National World War II Museum, OSS officer Harold Leith describes the rescue of General Wainwright and the moving question he asked when he knew that help had finally arrived.
Where was General Wainwright?
General Wainwright was in a camp 150 miles northeast. The doctor and I both went because we figured they might need medical work.
And you meet up with General Wainwright, correct?
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time talking with him. Well, he was very grateful that we were there, and he was just very nice to me. He thought that the Americans at home did not like him any, because he surrendered to the Japanese when the Japanese took over in the Philippines, and he wasn't supposed to surrender to them. MacArthur said he was not supposed to. So I told him that he was a hero as far as the American people were concerned, and he was very grateful when I told him this.
It's a pretty remarkable moment. I mean, and it really chokes me up when I see that footage of MacArthur handing Wainwright the pen, which we, as you say, show here in the museum, because this backstory is so remarkable. I mean, I think, it's symbolic not only in the sense of MacArthur handing this pen to the man who'd been forced to surrender, but the fact that he'd been in custody for so long and was essentially missing in the minds of the vast majority of the American public. It really makes that moment even more moving. There's also an irony that, longtime listeners to the podcast know that MacArthur is not a big OSS fan.
That's right.
And so, do you think that in MacArthur's mind, this changes his view of OSS, that they're able to pull off this pretty impressive operation to do something that he really wants done at the end of the war?
Unfortunately, no. There's always, throughout special operations history, there's been a tense relationship in a lot of ways between conventional military commanders and special operations. They're kind of looked down on, and even the leaders of these special operations unit, they're kind of sometimes looked down on and disparaged as either a sideshow or cowboys, or you have to worry that they're reckless and they're going to make the situation worse rather than better. I do think that perception has changed in some ways. You also have more, at least today, you have more special operations leaders who actually reach higher ranks and have more positions of authority. But, at the end point here in the Second World War, basically the OSS had very few allies in the U.S. government and among senior leaders. The writing was on the wall for the OSS as far as it was going to be disbanded. But one thing that I think emerges from this podcast series is intelligence and special operations is actually there to stay. I mean, even when they try and disband organizations like the OSS, and by the way, the Special Air Service for the Brits, Alamo Scouts, the SOE, you're getting rid of a lot of these special operations elements. But the people survive, Kit Kittleson, and then Colonel Aaron Bank, the founder of Army Special Forces, who actually was in China too on a different team, also named after birds. The teams were named after birds. General Jack Singlaub. These figures are still there, and their institutional knowledge is there, and the knowledge of what they were capable of doing that conventional units were not capable of doing, and that they were called on by senior leaders when there was no other option, like Gunnerside or like rescuing people at Cabanatuan, means that special operations is here to stay.
And Operation Cardinal is, a interestingly poorly timed victory, I guess, for OSS, given that it's already been shut down officially at that point. But it's still an impressive victory.
That's right, and that's the thing too about looking at cumulative victories. There's sort of a saying, even in the U.S. military today, there's like small victories. Like we say in our personal lives, like look for small victories. Once you start stacking them together, and particularly, and I said this about Cabanatuan, Gunnerside is a mission where all at the time is the Germans must not, even at the risk of our own deaths, they cannot get this weapon. And same thing with Cabanatuan. Henry Mucci tells his men, all the POWs come back or we don't. That's what they saw the stakes as. That's what they were willing to lose. This is tremendous, the most heroic and noblest sacrifices in some ways we see exhibited by the special operations and intelligence service members in the Second World War.
Despite the remarkable success of Operation Cardinal, the days are numbered for OSS. William J. Donovan has lost a key political ally with the death of President Franklin Roosevelt, and his old rival, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, is looking to expand his influence in the new Truman administration. On September 20th, 1945, just weeks after the signing of the Japanese surrender on board the USS Missouri, President Harry Truman signs an order shutting down OSS, effective October 1st. William J. Donovan will eventually return to private life, but not just yet. He'll play a personal role in the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. Nick Reynolds joins us again. Now, William Donovan himself will end up playing a role for a period of time, at least, in the actual Nuremberg trials themselves. Tell us about that.
So Donovan himself is deeply involved in this. As I say, it's like he's taken a second job. He's got one full-time job and then he's got a part-time job. If you look at his travel schedule for 1945, it's just mind-boggling. You find him in Asia, you find him in Europe. It's almost everywhere but Washington, right? So
it might be by choice.
It might be by choice. He flies to Nuremberg, flies to Germany, and he works with Jackson and the team on getting ready for the trials. And here's where the sort of the big personality conflict occurs. Once again, they have different approaches. One of it is just, no matter what, there would have been some kind of conflict. You can't have two leaders of this stature running momentous undertaking like this, right? I mean, this is something that's going to set precedents that we talk about today, and they know that. And so there are these two huge personalities that are probably going to clash no matter what, but they clash on some interesting topics, and one of them is collective guilt and individual guilt. Jackson favors designating criminal organizations, like certain parts of the SS, and the Nazi Party, the High Command, and so forth. And Donovan says, no, we should start at the other end. We should evaluate, we should prosecute men for things that they have done. We should prosecute Nazi officials because they signed an order to do X or Y, not because they were Nazi officials. No. So that's one major sticking point between the two. The other is their courtroom styles, and Donovan favors an approach that's going to be sort of Perry Mason kind of drama in the courtroom, with him being Perry Mason. Right? Jackson favors a much more hands-off, methodical approach. Donovan engages in negotiations with some of the senior Nazis. And basically, he's looking for something like a plea deal, which he can unfold in the, and then the Nazi's going to testify in court, and it's going to be really dramatic, and he's going to do the examination and the cross-examination and whatnot. And Jackson eventually decides, I'm in charge here. I can't control this. Thank you so much for your time, Bill. But this is towards the end of 1945, just before or around the time that the trial starts. It'd be November-ish, 1945, and Donovan goes home.
One other interesting aspect about the shutdown of OSS is that Bill Donovan doesn't necessarily go away quietly. And in fact, he takes some souvenirs, let's say, with him from his OSS days with the intention, I think, of writing the history of OSS. Tell us what happens with the OSS files.
So in the middle of September 1945, Donovan learns that OSS is going to be closed, shuttered at the end of the month. And he decides that he wants to control the history of OSS in more ways than one. He doesn't want anybody saying bad things about OSS. He wants to be able to rebut and advance his own agenda about what OSS did during the war. He also he tells people that he himself wants to write a history of American intelligence going back all the way to the Revolution. Has to wait for Jeff Rogg to do that, but that he's probably the first one. Donovan's probably the first one to say that he's going to start with OSS or start with the Revolution, go up to OSS. So he and 2 or 3 others secretly microfilm OSS records between the middle of September and the end of September. They do it largely at night. They have some rudimentary microfilm technology made by Kodak. Sort of looks like a sewing machine. And they create thousands of frames in this process. Eventually, those microfilms go to Donovan's office in New York. And it's a locked room and maybe a locked filing cabinet, but it's hardly a secure facility. And eventually, probably in the 1970s, the documents wind up back in government hands. And today, they're at the National Archives. You can see the original films at the National Archives in College Park. And if anybody wants to doubt that Donovan personally was involved, all they have to do is look at the literal fingerprints that are on some of the frames. You can see the hand of a person holding the documents. I don't think there's any doubt that Donovan actually did this. And there's also there's another collection at Churchill College, Cambridge.
What's interesting as well is it's a weird image. You have spies microfilming their own documents in their own headquarters, which is something that, of course, foreign spies would do in this period.
Sure, yeah. I mean, this would have made Duncan Lee's life so much easier, right? Or the NKVD guy's life so much easier. Just bring me the microfilm. We don't have to sit here with a yellow pad.
By late 1945, the largest war in human history is over. William J. Donovan's OSS has been shut down, but the threats facing the United States haven't gone away. They've just shifted. And President Harry Truman will quickly realize that while OSS may have been a wartime necessity, there's still a need for intelligence gathering, especially as a new conflict, a Cold War, begins. Jeff Rogg joins us for a final conversation of Season 2. Jeff, thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Bradley. Looking forward to talking about the end of the war with you and how its tradition continues to this day.
Jeff, one thing that you mentioned earlier on in the podcast series is that the end of the war isn't really the end of the war in so many ways. And, that's true both in Europe and the Pacific, maybe especially in the Pacific, because there's really, you have this moment on the deck of the USS Missouri where the surrender is signed by the Japanese delegation. But the conflict is still kind of rolling throughout Asia. There's millions of Japanese soldiers still in Manchuria. The Soviet Union has just invaded. The violence hasn't even necessarily ended. There's still holdout units on the Japanese side that don't believe the surrender is real or don't want to adhere to its terms. So tell us more about what this means for the intelligence community. There's really no end to the war in some senses.
One of the fascinating features that I think about as a historian when I look back at the Second World War is, other than the founding period of the United States, I don't see a time in American history where more great minds got together and helped plan a war, but also helped plan the post-war world. And so that's something where, when we talk about the lessons learned from wars, and sometimes historians and national security practitioners tend to be pessimistic. It's fashionable to be pessimistic. And so one thing that, I'm probably supposed to say as a historian is we need to look back and learn the lessons of that war today. So one of the big lessons is, again, getting your finest minds together and think really concretely through the challenges, not just of your present day, but the challenges ahead. And the OSS was doing that about the Soviet Union. People who were in operational units were in the field looking at the lay of the land and providing intelligence back to DC. And the OSS, they write this 60-ish page report on what to expect from the Soviet Union in the post-war world. And it even includes a country-by-country analysis. Why? Because they had people in those countries reporting back to them. And this is why you always need intelligence. Intelligence doesn't understand the distinction between war and peace. And the people who did intelligence during the Second World War, knew that, but not all the people in DC did. Now, they catch up kind of quickly, but going back to the larger issue of what's the real legacy and, where the United States finds itself today and what we can learn from this period. Well, there's a lot to learn. And, as I said, it's fashionable to be pessimistic. And it's okay for historians and national security practitioners to be pessimistic. We're kind of supposed to be by the nature of our job. But one thing I don't like as much is seeing so many Americans who are pessimistic today. And so that's why these stories are so remarkable and important to remember, because the one thing that I would want them to take away more than anything else, the one area of continuity is the people, the type of people, the quality of the individuals. I would draw a straight line from the Rangers at Cabanatuan and the Alamo Scouts and the Norwegian Commandos at Gunnerside and the Cardinal team who rescued Wainwright to the intelligence and special operators today. And so, we were lucky to have those people who volunteered and underwent tremendously difficult training, who risked their lives many times over on missions that no one else could do in the Second World War. And we're lucky to have people like that today.
Yeah, Americans and people of other nationalities who are willing to risk everything on missions that, unlike many conventional military operations, seem almost outlandishly unlikely to succeed in some senses. I mean, missions that are incredibly dangerous even by the standards of military missions. And one aspect of the Second World War that is unique, I think, actually in modern history, at least for the United States, is the fact that we end up in sort of an occupying role. But one facet of that is you have another group of people who are willing to take on extremely dangerous missions that fortunately never come to fruition, but those are the stay behind units. Who are the stay behind units, and what do they tell us about the post-war world?
The stay behind units arise out of what already had happened during the Second World War. This is why the legacy is so important. So you had resistance elements across Europe, even after, the Nazi takeover of different countries. Famously, we had talked about the Jedburghs, and especially in France with the Maquis, the resistance fighters. So the same concept the seed there was already germinating. Hey, we can do the same thing in the event of a Soviet takeover. And this was something that was a very real consideration for Americans and Brits at the end of the Second World War. What do we do if we get rolled over, the conventional forces get rolled over, and countries become occupied? Well, you had already these pre-existing resistance networks from the Second World War. And so we continued to arm them, train them, provide weapons that they could hide. And the idea was that in the event of a Soviet military takeover of a particular country of Western Europe, we would have stay-behind units. That legacy continues today.
Only a few years after the end of the war, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb. More than a decade later, China will detonate its own atomic bomb. How does the post-war world unfold here? And what kind of planning do we see as historians that indicates how people are perceiving the post-war period?
Well, one of the areas of continuity even before the Second World War is you already saw the seeds of the Cold War with the Russian Revolution, the emergence of communism, Soviet communism or socialism, and this, epical battle that you could see between communism as an idea, as a political economy, as an organizing principle, and then capitalism. And so that was why it was very much an alliance of convenience between the Soviet Union and the United States, when there was a lot of mutual suspicion and actually hatred. I mean, some leading figures, J. Edgar Hoover, had an abiding hatred of socialists and communists and anarchists and subversives. And so as the war is looking better and better for the Allies against the Germans, it's also looking worse and worse for the Allies against each other, because now you're worried about what your adversary's intentions are. As a historian, you got to sort of take the good with the bad. And, if there's one, and I shouldn't really use the word, but I'm trying to think of a better one to use, a good lesson of the Second World War for all sides is how destructive it was. And then when you get nukes, the Americans get the nuke first. And there's different debates over whether we needed to use it or not. And, was it to signal the Soviets? But one of the problems, of course, that we know is the Soviets had spies inside the whole time. We talked about Gunnerside. We had spies inside the German nuclear program. And it was a race to get to the bomb. Well, the Soviets get the bomb only a couple years later. They detonate their first one in August 1949, and it's actually one of the first big analytical failures that the CIA is accused of. Is how could you not know? The CIA incidentally actually said they were going to get a bomb. They just got the time wrong. They said something like, the latest 1953, maybe 1951, shrug the shoulders, and then it's 1949, and everyone's mad and says, how could you let us down? You can say that the American evolution of the bomb and the use of it in Japan was the onset of the nuclear age, but we were the only ones who had it. Now the Soviets get it. This is the nuclear age, and this is truly scary on a different level than even the Second World War in a lot of ways, because now what you're talking about is the annihilation of humanity, of the world. And so again, one of the interesting features of the Second World War is the people who experienced it and then taking that mindset into their later years. And something that emerges in the Soviet leadership, and Mel Leffler writes a book called For the Soul of Mankind. He's an American historian. And he talks about the relationship between American presidents and Soviet premiers. And one of the things that emerges is Soviet leaders had been really chastened by the Second World War. A lot of them, the level of loss and destruction, they experienced it so personally that they understood truly what it meant to have a nuclear war. They knew what, in its own way, what destruction looked like in a way that, by the way, a lot of American leaders didn't.
Well, tens of millions of Soviet citizens are killed, civilians, not only military. So this is a level of destruction that is exceeds the 416,000 or so Americans who are tragically killed.
And also what that destruction looks like in the United States. You don't have it. Pearl Harbor, we see the pictures, and that shocked Americans. But they had nothing like the Soviets, where cities are ruined. And tens of thousands, that's why that becomes a statistic. When Stalin kind of makes that quip about millions being a statistic, what this understanding of this first person witnessing and even personal loss that Soviets experienced is it imparts a certain level of responsibility and understanding in the nuclear age and dealing with the Americans. And, American leaders, many of them are chastened by the Second World War too in their own way. One of the scary things that I think of as a historian today is in some ways we're starting to see and hear nukes being talked about in a more cavalier way and the possibility of using them in our lifetime. And this is something that was the level of responsibility that you had when talking about nukes during the Cold War. I attribute a lot of it to the experience of the people involved in the Second World War, that direct legacy. Losing that and understanding what truly catastrophic World War looks like is something that is scary because no one really has it today. And they just think it's really bad, but in some ways aren't even acting like it.
Your book, The Spy and the State, is really the first comprehensive study of American intelligence from its origins and sort of the revolutionary period all the way up to the present day. What do you see as being the biggest legacy of OSS and Second World War sort of experiences on the intel community as we understand it in the post-war world? And what figure do you think had the most influence?
Well, this is a great way to summarize what's been, a series of really amazing podcasts with the World War II Museum. And it's hard for me to say anyone other than Donovan. Donovan, he's such a controversial, remarkable, he's a character out of a Hollywood movie. Just even before in the First World War, his courage. Then he's a Wall Street lawyer and a multimillionaire and sort of a rock star. And he has these icy eyes, larger than life. But his willingness, his dogged pursuit of changing a system that he saw was broken and disrupting it. That's, again, when I talk about the minds that changed the American national security system and the American intelligence system forever, he's one of them. And we talk about the need for disruption today, having Donovan-like figures. And that was really, the longstanding legacy is we understood that we couldn't follow the same patterns of the past, that we'd need a professional intelligence organization, professional, not just military moonlighting as intelligence or detectives moonlighting intelligence like we had in the Civil War or the First World War, the attaché system, but true intelligence professionals. And Alan Dulles even writes as much during the debates over the CIA. He said, intelligence, this isn't just some casual occupation. This is a profession. Donovan knew that. And he fought for it. And unfortunately, the one area, and this is the warning that you always have, is he also aspired to lead the CIA, and he didn't. But that's, a personal sacrifice that he made in a generation of people who made tremendous personal and professional sacrifices. And so that's the longstanding legacy, is what Donovan and the OSS did changed American intelligence forever. And we actually owe them a debt of gratitude because this country is safer and better off for it.
And actually, as historians, we owe OSS veterans a unique sort of debt of gratitude because of the archive being available in the way that it is at National Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. If anyone listening to the podcast wants to research this topic themselves, they actually played a major role in making that archive available.
And, this is truly it's a tremendous archive. One of the things that I like to see, and different societies are part of it, the OSS Society, very committed to it, is they help connect relatives of people who served in the OSS. It's a really nice network and collegial network where people say, I heard that my grandfather, grandmother, relative served in the OSS in some capacity. And a lot of historians, you can access the OSS rolls. You can see who was in there, and then you can find out more about them. And sometimes, actually it's intelligence, so there's dead ends, but oftentimes you can find out more about them. And, so that's one of our jobs as historians, is this isn't just big stories like you've heard here, it's also personal stories. And historians help make those connections and tell the personal stories.
The creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, in 1947 marked a new chapter in the history of American intelligence. And while this new agency is and was different from the OSS in key ways, it owed much to its wartime predecessor. Former leaders in the OSS, people who learned about the intelligence world from Wild Bill Donovan himself, like Allen Dulles and William Casey, become directors of the CIA. But despite various efforts, William Donovan himself never becomes CIA director. But in 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower appoints him ambassador to Thailand. Bill Donovan leaves that role the following year, returns to private life, and passes away in 1959. On hearing of his death, Dwight Eisenhower is said to have remarked that, quote, "We have lost the last hero." Wild Bill Donovan is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, under a headstone marking his World War I service and his Medal of Honor. There's no mention of OSS. But his legacy lives on, with a statue today in CIA headquarters and a living legacy in the intelligence community. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan paid tribute to OSS veterans at a meeting of the OSS Society.
I can't think of a more distinguished gathering than this one, nor can I think of any group whose accomplishments and devotion to country makes them more worthy of accolades and praise. And yet it's precisely that praise and those accolades that you decided to forego when you chose a twilight war, a secret profession, a profession where praise and thanks can only come from history and not from your contemporaries. And it's because secrecy has been your business that you all know how vital it is to your nation's safety and freedom's survival. And that's why I'm delighted to be here tonight. None of America's intelligence agents have inspired and protected their nation more than the men and women of the OSS. I cannot attempt to recount tonight the individual deeds. Bill Donovan, for example, what a remarkable man he was. A member of the Fighting 69th in the First World War, a winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor, a one-man intelligence service in the 30s and 40s, an American legend.
In 2018, veterans of the OSS received the Congressional Gold Medal in another recognition of their unique wartime service and a testimony to their role in winning the secret World War II. I'm Bradley W. Hart at the National World War II Museum. This is our last episode of Season 2 of The Secret World War II, but stay tuned for future episodes. The largest conflict in human history wasn't just one on the battlefield, it was also one in the shadows, and there are more stories from the shadows to tell.